Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Feldman. I'm a PhD candidate in political science, and I'm the coordinator of the Advanced Knowledges Working Group at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. We're very excited to welcome Professor Michael Sawyer to give a talk today. Before handing it over to Professor Bogues, who will introduce Dr. Sawyer, I'll just give a little bit of background on the Advanced Knowledges Working Group. The group consists of a number of graduate students who meet regularly to discuss politics, gender, and other topics in view of the afterlife of racial slavery. We're very grateful that the CSSJ offered us financial and logistical support to invite Dr. Sawyer, whose studies on these topics inform our discussions greatly, and who also completed his graduate studies here at Brown. And so we're excited to welcome him back to campus. Once again, thank you all for joining, and I'll now turn it over to Professor Bogues.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I would want to welcome you all to this lecture by Professor Michael Sawyer. What does one say about a colleague who was at one time the most intellectually intrepid student that one has taught, with interests ranging from literature to mathematics, philosophy, political theory, Africana studies, and comparative literature? Someone who has worked for the US Naval Intelligence, as well as in the financial sector. Someone from whom, after living a full life, decided in favor of a life of the mind. Not working within the academy as such, but really choosing the life of the mind as a way to wrestle with the profound questions of human life today. Trying to think about how to introduce Professor Sawyer, I found myself thinking about the work he did while he was a grad student at Brown, and how he organized the first graduate student workshop of the CSSJ, Slave, Citizen, and Human, and then became the first PhD candidate to graduate from the Brown Africana Studies Department. His oral exam was really like no other that we have had since then, with scholars from the fields of philosophy, comparative literature, Africana studies, and history. But then we should not have been surprised, as before he completed his PhD, he had done a Master's of Arts in Comparative Literature. In a profound sense, therefore, Professor Sawyer has one of the most interdisciplinary minds of his generation, and has a preoccupation with questions like the object and the thing, the dialectics of being, and how to create an Africana philosophy of existence. To be frank, this latter preoccupation is a task that I think will occupy him for some time, and to date his labors on this question are outstanding. He has published 2 books and is working on a 3rd. I would recommend to you this morning his book on the political philosophy of Malcolm X, Black-Minded. It is a text where the thought of Malcolm X is understood as philosophical thought operating in the political domain. Today, it gives me, therefore, great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Sawyer, the author of Africana philosophy of Temporality, Homo, Liminalis, and Black-Minded Political Philosophy of Malcolm X. He's an assistant professor at Colorado College, and also the head of the Africana Intellectual Project there. But I think more importantly, he is a Black intellectual preoccupied with trying to develop an Africana philosophy of being and existence. Professor Sawyer.
Well, it's really hard to talk after or speak after an introduction like that. It's really good to be home, and Brown's Africana Studies Department is really home for me. And I think just to pick up on what what Professor Bogues is saying. It's like it's a family situation where I've never felt I wasn't completely supported, particularly by Professor Bogues, and this invitation is indicative of that. So I really want to thank Africana Studies, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, Jeffrey Feldman, who I had the good fortune to work with on another project that we did here at Colorado College that was supported by the University of Bologna, and also everyone in the technical support division there that's been so helpful. Before I get started and to take this up, I want to dedicate this talk to Professor Nani Jorginho, who was a mentor, friend, and member of my dissertation committee who we lost recently. And I'm looking forward to the memorial of his life and intellect that'll happen in a month or so. And it's really good to be home, even virtually. So I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the conversation around this project. So thank you to everyone. The title of this talk, The Threshold of the Door of Return, takes up a central portion of what I will call the elements of the door of no return, a phenomenology of blackness, which is the title of a new book project that I'm trying to bring in for a landing. The project is in large measure preoccupied with the manner in which Christina Sharp references Dion Brandt's text, A Map to the Door of No Return, in chapter 1 of In the Wake on Blackness and Being. By way of Sylvia Winder's concept of a type of Black existence that is victim of, quote, narratively condemned status, close quote, Sharp calls for, quote, new ways of entering and leaving the archives of slavery, close quote. Sharp believes that this concept is found in the Brand reference here in what is described as a kind of undisciplined knowledge, an unscientific method that comes from observing that where one stands is relative to the door of no return. As Professor Bogues mentioned exactly a year ago, I published Black Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X. And having the opportunity to live with and through the book, I've come to believe that what Malcolm X describes as becoming Black-minded enough is to exist in a manner resonant with Brand's unscientific method. Further, I've come to understand becoming and/or being Black-minded as a form of consciousness that is brought into existence by, recognized through, and stabilized throughout by a system of cognition that is also best described as Black-minded. I further believe that becoming or being Black-minded creates a spatial imaginary, a dreamscape that brings us into a state of awareness of the physical and metaphysical limits of what Winter calls our narratively condemned state. I want to emphasize following Winter that this status appears to have limits, and in that there are limits. Once we have effectively mapped the boundaries of this deprivation, we can exceed them. If it's not clear, I will be explicit. I believe the strands of Black radical thought have effectively identified the walls that limit the horizon of possibility for Black being, and have placed a challenge before all of us to theorize how these same limits can be rendered inoperative. In this mapping, and here I'm taking what I understand to be authorized by the following quote that serves as the epigraph to Brandt's text, quote, but to the door of no return, which is illuminated in the consciousness of Blacks in the diaspora, there are no maps. The door is not merely physicality, it is a spatial location. It is also perhaps a psychic destination, since leaving was never voluntary, return was and still may be an intention, however deeply buried. There is, as it says, no way in, no return, close quote. I'm proposing that the reason there is no map is because one is not necessary, or more to the point, not possible. What I mean is that to accurately map the being of Blackness, there's no possibility to render it without it existing in a one-to-one ratio with the world as we know it. What this means is that a map to the door would be an exact recreation of the world it maps that, if produced, would cover the world completely with a simulacrum that would perhaps be indistinguishable from the territory that it replicates. Second, a map is not necessary because, as the title of this talk proposes, we are already here at the threshold of the place of departure that I'm endeavoring to release from its perceived impenetrability, and being at the threshold, no further instruction as to how to reach this place is relevant. To pursue this point a bit further, I would also like to say that there was and is a form of mapping, if not a map, whose cartographers have names that we are known to us. They include, but not are limited to, Equiano, Harriet, Jacobson, Tubman, Douglas, Washington, Du Bois, Hurston, Baldwin, X, King, Rustin, Hamer. You get what I mean. What I'm proposing is that to become Black-minded is to be able to assemble in useful order the archive of the Black radical tradition that has led us back to the place of departure as if we never left. More precisely, following Ralph Ellison, quote, but that is getting too far ahead of the story, almost to the end, although the end is the beginning and lies far ahead, close quote. What this seems to mean, and this speaks to a particular form of Africana temporal being, that to stand at the threshold of the place of departure and render it a place of return is to loop the linearity of existence in this manner. where the node depicted here is both the space-time of leaving and returning that assembles itself as a place of observation that allows everything that happened between those events to be viewed as what I take the R.A. Judy of sentient flesh to frame as poiesis in Black. You may very well say it instantiates parasemiosis, that is to say, multiplicious vectors of performance in referentiality. These vectors in turn may be regarded metaphorically as topologically long lines, such that although roughly homomorphic to one another, the characteristics of the lines' relationality is apposition, or being an appositionality, whereby multiple orders of referentiality converge without synthesis, entailing dynamic properties of infinite diffusion, according to the flow of which a function may be expressed in infinite divisibility. This, in the reading to pursue here, is resonant with the passage that follows here in the Sharp that notes where one stands is relative to the door of no return, and that moment of historical and ongoing rupture. But this is the ground I've been trying to articulate a method of encountering a past that is not past. The argument for this book project frames itself in the following manner, that one, the current state of Black thought has effectively mapped the world of white supremacy that finds its frontier or limit at the threshold of the door. Two, that we should resist thinking that renders the door unlocatable or the reversal of its logic impossible. And three, an important step in developing the cognitive tools necessary for this exercise is naming the physical and metaphysical barrier to a true phenomenology of Blackness. With that in mind, corporeal or metaphysical, what Patterson calls social death, must be understood for its role in barring the door. This next section I entitled Death, and the epigraph is, I spit phrases that'll thrill you, you're nobody till somebody kills you. The tagline for this consideration of death is you're nobody till somebody kills you. I'm concerned with death here in the way that Orlando Patterson has situated social death as a threshold condition for the worthfulness of Black bodies within the logic of white supremacy as a result of being rendered effectively worth less. In the interest of time, and also in the interest of avoiding our time together being invaded by Hegel, I have to say briefly that the relationship of the Black body to death is best understood through its presence in the dialectic that is the object of concern within this intellectual tradition, both explicitly and implicitly. Du Bois is concerned that the tripartite nature of subaltern self-consciousness, second sight, double consciousness, and two-ness do not result in what he calls true self-consciousness. I take to be a claim that is most ably understood in its engagement with the Hegelian conceptualization of self-consciousness. What I mean is that in my reading, Hegel effectively describes the functioning of white supremacy and the utility of death in section 451 of the Phenomenology of Spirit that reads, "Death is the consummation and the highest work that the individual as such undertakes for the polity. However, insofar as he is essentially singularly individual, it is contingent as to whether his death was both immediately connected with and was a result of his work for the universal." Close quote. In reckoning with death for the vehicle for progress towards self-consciousness, it is critical to note that it is metaphoric death and conflict that attend the non-Black subjects Hegel is thinking about, which is not the same as the real death that confronts the quote, Negroes, close quote, he is intent upon not thinking about by thinking about. What I mean by this is that the door of return is rendered or understood as a door of no return because of the functioning of white supremacy that employs death as a threshold condition for subjective recreation. Again, this is not metaphoric for the subjects that concern us here, in that Black death and Black suffering are the forests and trees that we must navigate to unlock the place of return. With that in mind, I wish I'd never heard of Breonna Taylor. What I really mean is that I wish Breonna Taylor only ceased being nobody in the same way we are all nobody to those who don't know us until they get to know us, rather than becoming somebody upon the moment of her death. To be more precise, I had never heard of the Breonna Taylor who showed up on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine, who I call here Breonna Taylor 2, as distinct from the person formerly known as Breonna Taylor, who I will call the real Breonna Taylor. I wish I never knew about Breonna Taylor 2, who was in some ways eulogized by Ta-Nehisi Coates and depicted by artist Amy Sherald, which is to say that I wish that the real Breonna Taylor had never been murdered and become somebody when somebody killed her and had just grown old, somebody in the awareness of those who loved her and knew her. I don't mean that the real Breonna Taylor was nobody, but I do mean that she was nobody who would be depicted as a hipper version of Michelle Obama, whose portrait of the First Lady dressed like Breonna Taylor 2 hangs in the National Picture Gallery. The real Breonna Taylor is also nobody who would show up in an essay about her actual life that ended in a barrage of gunfire from the police while her significant other called the same police to tell them that they had, quote, kicked in the door and shot his girlfriend, close quote. Only Breonna Taylor 2, resurrected from the tragedy, could have an essay written in its wake entitled A Beautiful Life, in the sense that her actual life would attract any of the attention it has achieved because of its tragic end that somehow is folded over onto the quotidian nature of the life of the real Brianna Taylor that can render its hideous end beautiful. We are back to Hegel by way of Bed-Stuy and Biggie Smalls. Somewhere and when about we must label the sublime paradox of Black life-death. Recall what Hegel's metaphysics requires of the subject desiring the journey to absolute knowing, writing in 451, death is the consummation and the highest work that the individual as such undertakes for the polity, close quote. The blackened bodies that concern Biggie, exemplified by the real Brianna Taylor, are subjectively inert, existing as non-subjects. No bodies, excluded from the possibility of citizenship as a corporeal being mired in embodied nobodiness, that at the point of impact with the kinetic power of white supremacy are transformed into figures like the disembodied, somebodied Brianna Taylor too, the beautiful life that arrives only with death. The possibilities here confound forward progress. If we take Hegel's reading of white supremacy for its word, the life of the real Brianna Taylor only becomes abstractly valuable with the corporeal death of the real Brianna Taylor, who is resurrected as Brianna too, unrecognizable even to herself. What I'm compelled to wonder is what the real Brianna Taylor in some surreal encounter with the future Brianna Taylor too, that stands in for her, would think of herself post-mortem. The proposal is that to accept Coates' characterization and Cheryl's transubstantiation, we must reckon with what that acceptance portends. Basically, Black subjects achieve disproportionate worth against and through disproportionate worthlessness in the reckoning of white supremacy through an encounter with untimely death. With this in mind, we cannot therefore allow these deaths to be a terminus in the sense of having no value post-mortem, nor can we allow the value of Black death to appear only as a result of coercive threat. A proper phenomenology of Blackness disallows death as a terminus for subjects who have lived a life in constant conversation with catastrophe. A state of affairs that I'm reading is different than a catastrophic life. Trying to stay alive gets in the way of living. When death arrives implicated or perhaps cloaked in white supremacy, cutting against Hegel's self-serving, that self being whiteness, admonition to the included through exclusion, to be afraid, serves as a clearing or point of transition that is heavy with the weight of what I understand to be three different ways in which to describe the place of radical self-recreation that I believe is described by Du Bois's veil, Fanon's zone of non-being and zone of Haussures, and Christina Sharp's retinal attachment. All three of these ways of thinking would most productively be revealed simultaneously, but in lieu of that, I will examine the last of them. The third leg of this effort triangulates the doorway into the self-referentially valorized Black subjectivity is through a return to the thinking of Christina Sharp, again from In the Wake on Blackness and Being. The preoccupation here is with what Sharp refers to as retinal detachment, a subsection of the chapter The Hold. Here Sharp transcribes visual artist Kara Walker's description of creative space that she, Walker, periodically finds herself from Arthur Jafa's film Dreams Are Colder Than Death. Quote, when I find myself in this schism, in this kind of mercurial space that's sort of non-gendered and non-raced and constantly being sorted or encroached upon, my skin keeps trying to stick itself back on. I'm working and then I become aware of the skin and everything that comes with it, and I kind of like detach, just slightly, not all the way. It's not into that space. I'm getting this image of retinal detachment or something. The skin is literally kind of pulled away and it's kind of gory and grotesque. That's where I feel at home. It's not a safe place to be, but it's one where you can kind of look at the underside of race a little bit, close quote. Sharp reads this notion of retinal detachment as a technology, that's my term, that, quote, allows for powerful forces and images to emerge from and move through her being Walker, but only within a particular range, close quote. I agree with this reading that proposes a narrowing, if not bracketing, of vision here, but endeavor to read it against and through Fanon, back to Du Bois, and then forward to the potential of a new opening that is at stake, what I'm calling the threshold of the door of return. Working as I propose in some sense backwards from the description provided by Walker, that this is not a safe space to be, but one where you can kind of look at the underside of race, it seems resonant with Fanon's admonition regarding access to the zone of non-being that reads, quote, in most cases, the Black man cannot take advantage of this descent into a veritable hell, close quote. The French term in these prose employed by Fanon to describe the goings-on within the zone of non-being, dépouiller, is translated in most versions as bare, but is more accurately rendered as describing something akin to plucking the feathers from a chicken or a depilatory. Obviously, this echoes the description by Kara Walker of the creative space where her skin is, quote, literally kind of pulled away, close quote. Additionally, Walker points us to the possibility of a new type of seeing that I understand to be different than the Du Boisian seeing of second sight. Walker notes that in the schism, she can kind of look at the underside of race. This seems at odds with the manner in which I'm reading the first movement of Du Bois's system of tripartite subaltern self-consciousness, Second Sight, that is a gift that, quote, only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world, close quote. In Walker's space of schism, which is at least the entrepot to what I'm calling a new world, she's able to see the underside of race that I'm reading here as the truth of the matter, which is necessarily different than seeing oneself through the cognitive regime of racists. Pace Du Bois, Walker reveals the next step along the way, which is resonant in the sense of being contrapuntal to Du Bois's description of double consciousness. For Du Bois, this stage of consciousness is, quote, a peculiar sensation, a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, close quote. This does not seem to be what Carol Walker describes, which as a product of, quote, retinal detachment, close quote, is, quote, where the skin is literally kind of pulled away, and that's where she feels like she's at home. The final step of movement in this advance beyond, in some sense, Du Bois's trapped subject, what he describes as two-ness, is where Walker is again out of phase with the unresolvable tension that Du Bois points us to between Negro and American that threatens to destroy the dark body. Instead, Walker describes a mercurial space that's sort of non-gendered and non-raced, but still unstable because it is constantly being encroached upon. She says, my skin keeps trying to stick itself back on. It is this instability, the impermanence, or perhaps more carefully, the unreliability of the schism that indicates that the space being described here is one of liminality or transition rather than the new space of being as Black that we are seeking. It appears, and here the palimpsest that has been established through the sequential reckoning with the veil, Fanon's two zones, and Sharp's preoccupation with Walker's schism become a collage of these images that approach our cognition as they may rather than in order. Here in this space, at this threshold, Du Bois's veil has been lifted to allow for the descent into Fanon's dual zones of subjective reconstruction, where Walker feels negatively framed Blackness being stripped away from her body qua her body, that is Black in its otherness from the Black of the white gaze, which throws us back to the competing images of Breonna Taylor and what I understand is a resurrection or raising of the body. Here I'm thinking of Jean-Luc Nancy's short text, Noli Me Tangere, on the raising of the body, that takes careful stock of the scene of the risen Christ, who upon encountering the Magdalene warns her, touch me not, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascended upon my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God, close quote. Here behind the veil in the depths of the Phenonian zones, as the skin is pulled from the body in the wake, the cut, the break, as before the vacant tomb, the no longer dead body is subject to an altered regime of cognition that Nancy recognizes as parable. Parable, again, in the sense of the biblical notion, then Nancy productively glosses in the following fashion, tracing the contours of the definition of parable by Jesus to the disciples in service of explaining his use to them. They're meant, Christ says, for those to whom it is not given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, meant for those who seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. The parable, this is Nancy's gloss on this, might be expected to open their eyes, informing them of proper meaning through this figurative system, but Jesus says nothing of the sort, making one of the most well-known and paradoxical statements, and this is Christ speaking, for whoever hath to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance, but whoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that which he hath, close quote. Thus the objective of the parable is first to sustain the blindness of those who do not see. It does not proceed out of a pedagogy of figuration or allegory or illustration, but to the contrary, out of a refusal or a denial of pedagogy, close quote. With this understanding, I'm preoccupied with sorting through the manner in which the actual life of the real Breonna Taylor at the point of death is recast as a parable of the beautiful life of Breonna Taylor too, the iconography or visual documentation of which, similar to the resurrection of Christ, is unrecognizable to those who knew the real Breonna Taylor. And here I'm thinking through and with Nicole Fleetwood's notion from her text on racial icons, where she proposes, quote, racial iconicity hinges on a relationship between veneration and degradation. This twinning shapes the visual production and reception of Black icons, close quote. Nancy continues to be relevant here in this careful analysis of the event of Mary Magdalene's encounter with the newly risen Christ, an artistic representation of the same. To return to the site in front of the now empty tomb, Mary Magdalene encounters a figure who she believes is the gardener. This is Nancy's gloss on this photograph, this image. Another aspect of the intrigue of vision involves the mistake Mary Magdalene initially makes when she thinks she is seeing the gardener. For this mistake to be possible, Jesus must not be recognizable, or at least not immediately so. The difficulties involved in recognizing Christ have a twofold significance. On the one hand, it is as if his resemblance to himself were a suspended and floating moment. He is the same, altered within himself. He has already left. He is no longer where he is. He no longer is as he is. He is dead, which is to say that he is not what or who he at the same time is or presents. He is his own alteration and his own absence. He is properly only his impropriety. On the other hand, the difficult and uncertain recognition bears the stakes of faith. It is not consistent in recognizing the known, but entrusting oneself to the unknown. Close quote. To be clear, it is truly what goes on within the tomb, behind the veil, in the zones and the schism that will ultimately be the point of focus of this project. But it's here on the other side that we see Christ as unrecognizable in the same manner that the real Breonna Taylor bears no resemblance to Breonna Taylor too. The question substantially is whether the death of the real Breonna Taylor has resulted in a positively altered being that appears as Breonna Taylor too, in the same manner as the resurrected Christ. Mapping this on top of the fork in the road and the reconstruction of the subject road, the way through the zone of non-being and/or the zone of Hoshures presented by Fanon, Breonna Taylor too must necessarily be the result of one or the other of these typologies of subject dereconstruction. In the case of the examination that we have of the resurrected Christ and the inability of his intimates to recognize him without further context, it is clear that the process has resolved itself positively. Stated differently, the unrecognizable nature of the risen Christ is indicative of a transformation to a higher state of being that is no longer subject to the problematics of marginalized human existence. Quote, "Do not hold on to me because I have not yet ascended to the Father." That's John 20:17. As Nancy asserts, the scene is organized around vision. It is a result of the resurrection that has altered Christ that Nancy describes in this fashion. The resurrection is not a resuscitation. It is the infinite extension of death that displaces and dismantles all the value of presence and absence of animate and inanimate, of body and soul. The resurrection is the extension of a body to the measure of the world and the space in which all bodies meet. In this case, the discourse around what I'm framing as the resurrected figure that appears as Breonna Taylor too is likewise organized around the vision, or more directly, the creation and/or manipulation of the real Breonna Taylor. As with what transpires before the now empty tomb, we likewise are standing in the aftermath of the burial space and time of Breonna Taylor, who we will never know, and who is distinct from both the real Breonna Taylor and Breonna Taylor too, now murdered, now buried, and now appearing in diaphanous robes of impossibly rendered blue that belie the life darker than blue that ended tragically. Here, unlike the sanctified resurrection corporeal appearance of the risen Christ, the Breonna that our eyes have before us, Breonna Taylor too, is not a vision of positively resolved subjectivity. At least the concept of visuality we possess on this side of the veil, zones, break, and the wake, do not afford us eyes with which to see what has truly become of the Breonna Taylor, who has passed from this world as ideally bounded and stable in a resolved space of phenomenal blackness. To be clear, the argument acknowledges Christina Sharp's concern that Kara Walker's retinal detachment, quote, hinders one's vision, close quote. At the same time, is preoccupied with retinal attachment, a condition that provides a different manner of seeing that I'm positing is the mechanism by which the body that we cannot see and or recognize stands revealed. Sharp's thinking here is instructive. We are positioned in the knowledge that we are living in the afterlives of slavery, sitting in the room with history in a lived and undeclared state of emergency. The ground of compromise, the firmament, the access to freedom and democracy littered with Black bodies. With the optic of the door of no return on our retina, we might imagine something else, something like what Joy James calls a liberated zone, even though under siege, close quote. The possibility exists that two things are happening at once to a subject like Breonna Taylor, who encounters this form of subject disforming death. At the same time, we, the observers of the phenomena, like Mary Magdalene, have not ourselves journeyed through the tomb and are not able to witness anything but the garbled apparition of Christ, who appears to be a gardener until the proper context for seeing is granted. The point here is that because of the unaltered system of seeing of those who observe the transformation and transubstantiation of the subject, second sight, retinal detachment, or attachment, they are not able to see anything but the misrecognized subject. This then requires an account of the manner in which the true nature of the subject that has journeyed through the zones of non-being and Hoshures can be witnessed or recognized by outsiders who themselves have not completed the journey. The body chastised through this discourse with death is effectively doubled. The discernible subject is implicated in a continued malformation of Black being that renders Breonna Taylor recognizable by being unrecognizable. The second body has moved on to the second form of phenomenological apparition that will only be recognizable when the observer has been properly resituated to see differently. Until we have articulated that practice, we must first deal with the reality of the deformed experience of Black subjectivity that is still tethered to this world. Returning to Nancy, who proposes that it is faith that serves as the mechanism by which Mary Magdalene comes to see the resurrected Christ. Mary's faith consists in her trust that he who calls her calls no other, this is Nancy, a quote from Nancy, than her, and that there is fidelity to this naming. Mary does not demonstrate her faith through statements, hypothesis, or calculation. She leaves. The response to the truth that is on the point of departure is to leave with it. The faith that Nancy explores here is an integral component part of the fact that the description of the events here within the four corners of the gospel fulfill the promise of faith. The fulfillment of the promise of faith necessarily is served by the departure to spread the doctrine in the form of the news of the resurrection. With respect to Black bodies coerced through death and disfigured in the aftermath, we are confronting faith in a different form, one that's potentially debilitating. Fanon and Sharp are all concerned with the totalizing effect of this form of death that renders the body absent and incapable of being properly memorialized. What this means for this argument is that this form of faith only allows us to recognize the unrecognizable as a product of anti-Black racism. The faith that allows what should be the incomprehensibility of the juxtaposition of Breonna Taylor, the Breonna Taylor 2, the real Breonna Taylor, is belief in the crushing weight of impending doom. What Christina Sharp calls, quote, the everyday of Black imminent and imminent death, close quote. The awareness that amounts to the knowledge that all Black people are subject to the discourse of disformation through improper memorial of death as a result of unlawful death at the hands of the state, acts done in service of reinstating on a constant basis the fear of white supremacy, Hegel's fear of the master. The Melville of Moby Dick engages the concept by writing, quote, but faith like a jackal feeds among the tombs, and even from these dead doubts, she gathers her most vital hope, close quote. The faith that attends the recognition of the unrecognizable is not the good news that Magdalene leaves the garden with, but faith in the howling savagery of white supremacy. This atmospheric pressure is what I'm proposing presents the engine of Afro-pessimism that sees no way in which the condition of anti-Black racism can be ameliorated, much less eradicated. Ultimately, the goal of this project is to tease out the characteristics of the space in question as we linger in our imaginations here on the shores of Ghana, attempting to reverse the passage and groping for a way back in. I imagine it must be truly, finally dark here. Hopefully dark because, as Allison described, there's a particular form of darkness that can then be illuminated to render the subject recognizable even to themselves. He writes, quote, without light, I am not only invisible, but formless as well. And to be unaware of one's form is to live a death. I myself, after existing some 20 years, did not become alive until I discovered my invisibility, close quote. I imagine that Jimi Hendrix in his synesthetic relationship to color, sound, taste, and feeling knows his place. In acts as bold as love, he proposes from his space deep in the blues that, quote, blue are the life-giving waters taken for granted, they quietly understand, close quote. But this space here at the threshold of the door of no return is where the blues have become Black because they have layered themselves one upon the other. It is Black here, a unique form of Black in its relationship to the life-giving and life-defining blues because the bodies are arrayed here as false warning sign, a farmer of bones against proceeding. It is darker than blue here because the reality of the gravitational force of white supremacy has grounded Blackness to the false floor of anti-Blackness to establish a system of enthralled regard of that condition. It is Black here because by altering our system of cognition of and within this space, we can reinvigorate an exhausted system of consciousness and blacken our minds in order to properly approach the seemingly impregnable door with a spell of unlocking upon our lips and pass through it without touching. Beyond its threshold, I imagine there's Blackness qua Blackness, non-dialectically formed but hypersensitive to the archival presence of the conditions that made the return necessary in the first place, the type of cognition that is darker than blue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sawyer. What a really excellent talk. I will be moderating a Q&A now. So for anyone who has a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I will read the questions as they come in. We have about 20 or so minutes. So thank you again for this talk. I'm happy to get us started off with the first question. Before I do so, I just want to thank a couple of folks who are here, including Kristen May, Zuri Arman, as well as Justin Lang and Malcolm Thompson, who are part of the Advanced Knowledges Working Group. And helped, make this possible. So in your talk, Professor Sawyer, you drew on a number of Black feminist thinkers, and you also drew on the case Breonna Taylor. And, you know, terribly, there are a number of the Black dead whose cases you could have drawn on. So I was, aside from the fact that this is her, you know, the anniversary of, this week was the anniversary of her murder, I was interested to hear you say a little bit more about the role of gender in your thinking of Black subjectivity and the role that gender plays in thinking about the mapping of the door of return.
So thanks for the question, Jeffrey. I think for me, it's the juxtaposition between the iconic image of Emmett Till and what's happened with the iconography surrounding the death, the murder of Breonna Taylor, right? And so what I'm trying to reference is Emmett Till's mother was up to a different type of mapping that could very well relate itself to the manner in which we perceive gender and the notion of bodies that have been coerced in that way, right? Where the goal of Mamie Till was to present Emmett Till's body as a type of warning and memorial of what lynching portends. And I think that something different is going on with respect to gender and the question of death in this manner with respect to Breonna Taylor's memorial, what I think is improper memorial of her death in this kind of iconic image that's been created that to me erases the kind of Blackness and blueness that are important for this, right? And so drawing on to get to that point, I think that there are quite a few thinkers, and this is primarily, I think, Nicole Fleetwood's work in the notion of the Black icon that talks about the way in which women's bodies are situated, Black women's bodies in particular, are situated vis-a-vis state power that gives us a space to kind of work in and around to try to figure out exactly what the results of that type of iconic memorial of the state violence would happen to be. So that's the reason I was preoccupied with that image and then that archive of Black women, Black feminist thinkers who are focused on that aspect of the presentation of bodies and the spectacle of the death or mistreatment of Black women's bodies.
Thank you. So we just received a question from one of the attendees who asks you to speak a little bit more on the tripartite subaltern subconscious. And I think this is probably in reference to your discussion of Du Bois. Yeah,
that's a term I kind of used in the first book to describe what I think of the interlocking relationship between what Du Bois describes in the opening moments of Soul of the Black Folk, this notion of second sight, double consciousness, and two-ness. And what I'm proposing is that creates for Du Bois a type of subaltern self-consciousness that he explicitly notes as always, ever, and only able to exist in that way, right? So the challenge that I think Du Bois places before readers of him and our sociality and thinking in general is to figure out how to deconstruct that moment, right? How to have an awareness of the awareness of the fact that the way the Black body thinks about the Black body is oftentimes through the vision of those who think negatively about it, right? This is back to Morris and the Bluest Eye and ways of thinking about self-hatred as what I think is a type of strange type of narcissism, right? Where you pay attention to the body to the point of it becoming frozen in a particular space. So what I'm arguing is that Du Bois presents that as a type of self-consciousness and his reflection on what Hegel establishes as the impossibility of journeying through the dialectic without achieving a particular type of self-consciousness that only arrives for Hegel in this discursive relationship with death. So I'm arguing, and this is part of the book that we didn't have time to discuss here, is that the reason Hegel is preoccupied with that is because, and this goes back to some of the work that I think Susan Buck Morris does, appropriately situating Hegel's relationship to thinking about Saint-Domingue and the Haitian Revolution and thinking about a way to resist what he thinks is calls the topsy-turvy or inverted world where Black becomes white and white becomes Black. And by situating death as a barrier to prevent something like actual self-consciousness within the concept of white supremacy, it prevents the journey towards that type of historical consciousness of Black subjectivity that he being Hegel, or Hegel describing white supremacy, wants to resist.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience about Christina Sharp. The question asks how Sharp has responded to your work, or how she might respond to your work. I would add, I guess, I would like to ask, in relation to that question, where you see any friction between your discussion of Kara Walker and Sharp's skepticism or her limitations that she sees in Kara Walker's work, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a new project. I won't presume to kind of guess what Professor Sharp would think about it. I would benefit greatly from having that critique, I think. So, but I don't view it as oppositional, dialectically opposed to what is presented in the Wake. I think in the Wake presents a type of opening, right? And I think in that opening, I think there are multiple different ways to kind of consider the proposals that happen to come out of Christina Sharp's argumentation, right? And this to me is just one of them, because I think Kara Walker, when read against and through these other thinkers that I placed alongside of this, may be describing something that functions in a way that delivers what Christina Sharp is looking for, this kind of undisciplined way of thought, right? And that it's already arrived, and it's not actually a type of limitation. My argument is that it's only a limitation because our system of cognition is not up to being able to take careful stock of what may look like a limitation, but is actually a type of broadening, or more appropriately, a type of hyper focus on the thing that's most important to pay attention to. So I don't think that there's, and this is to your follow on to the question, Jeffrey, I don't know that there's friction with Christina Sharp's argument, because again, I have a preoccupation with that work that I think is positive, but I think it's endeavoring to perhaps develop a different conclusion to that piece of that body of work at this point.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question from Allison Rollins, which reads, in using the language of the eye, Walker and Sharp, and the door, I'm wondering if you were considering any other orifices, eye, ear, mouth, etc., as types of portals. Also, Eric Gardner worked briefly for the Parks and Rec horticultural department, and your mention of Mary Magdalene mistaking the gardener. Is there more you could speak on the relationship to gardening, horticulture, nature curation?
Yeah, I think this is, for me, is where I just briefly gestured it, where a thinker, and I'm situating Jimi Hendrix as a type of thinker who basically pulls down the borders of sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch, etc. Right? So to get to Professor Rollins' question, I think that puts at stake exactly that, right? Because what may seem to some as a type of seeing may be a type of hearing to others. It may have sound to it. And my point is that this is situating Black thought firmly in its relationship to the blues and the sonic, is that then it creates in that relationship to the sonic things that we can look at, things that we can smell, things that we can taste, and even to this question, things that we can potentially grow. Because I think growth is a helpful way to think about what I'm proposing happens. That's why I mentioned briefly this notion of a Black forest of trees and a forest and trees, right? Because there seemed to me to be this notion of a type of growing or fecundity, I think, of both thought and activity that is potentially important for thinking through this problem.
Thank you. So we have another question from Nikki Clements, who writes, thank you for your powerful talk. I would love to know what you think about the possibilities for philosophizing the body and the flesh, especially when it comes to exposing and countering white supremacist normative subjectivity. You invoke Judy's sentient flesh, for example.
No, this is really helpful. This is a conversation that Nikki and we were colleagues at Brown, and one of the formative places for this thinking was in the Hegel seminar that I took in the religion department, which Nikki and I were students in, right? And in that thinking, this notion of what R.A. Judy is up to with rendering the flesh, I think, and this is my reading of sentient flesh, and I know Professor Bogues has a close relationship to this work as well, right? That it's and this to me is much of what Merleau-Ponty actually proposes, that the body becomes a type of receptor for the world in that way, right? And in my argumentation, this is to build on what I was hoping to pull off in thinking with Malcolm X's notion of the corporeality of Black subjectivity, is that the Black body becomes a type of political space that is also the space of sensation, a space of progress, and a space of transportation of both ideas and progress of the body. So the flesh body separation, this gets back to where Ronald Judy starts with Hortense Spillers, right? And this question of what do we make of flesh as opposed or in opposition to something like the body. And this gets to this question that I also raise of transubstantiation here, right? Where, and this is thinking through the notion of the body and blood of Christ, right? And I'm arguing that there's a system of transubstantiation that happens with respect to Black subjectivity that creates exactly this kind of binary proposition between the body actually, the flesh actually, the body is represented and flesh is represented. That there's what Ronald Judy thinks about as this asymptotic relationship between those 3 or 4 different ways of being. So no, it's important. I've got to really think more carefully about that. So that's really helpful.
Thank you. We still have a couple more minutes, so if anybody would like to add some more questions to the Q&A, please do so. Yeah, just to add on to that last question, could you say more about the transubstantiation and how you narrativize that? Would you say that that's a phenomenon that takes place in sort of, and I guess, you know, part of what you're doing is challenging a certain kind of linear temporality of mapping, and but so just, is that something that is, you know, in the threshold of the door of no return, prior to it, or on the other side? If you could just say more. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a big challenge. I'm trying to figure out whether the transubstantiation is, to your point, right? Whether it presupposes access to or whether transubstantiation is a necessary threshold condition of witnessing the threshold of the door, whether it's a necessary condition of passing through it, or whether there's a type of transubstantiated subject on the other side, right? Or maybe it's all 3, to get to your point of this kind of temporal and spatial disorientation, right? Where all 3 of those things circle around each other and create sort of this was what I said about a spatial imaginary that allows the existence of all 3 subjects: the transubstantiated subject, the subject to be transubstantiated, and the resolved subject from which the transubstantiation happens can exist in the same space at the same time. And so I'm still working on trying to figure out how all that fits together.
Thank you. We have one question from Kim Wright King. How do you see Afrofuturism and the spiritual, existential, and spatial framework in relation to the door of no return against the backdrop of ancestral grounding that ebbs/flows temporally?
Yeah, that's when I was listing, I think Afrofuturism and Afrosurrealism are actually part of what I call the cartography of what is not required to have a map to the door, right? I think a lot of this work has been done, and what I'm proposing is that part of the intellectual effort that has to be undertaken is to correctly assemble all these different ways of describing this phenomena, and then being able to take stock of them, and whether they're visual, whether they're in literature, whether they're in cinema. I think there are a lot of them that are happening at the same time, and Afrofuturism and surrealism is certainly part of that argumentation to figure out exactly what's going on. This question of that relationship to ancestry, and as a type of, this is what I think Sharp means by a past that is no longer historical, right? It's a past that's both present and future. I think is interesting to pursue that line of reasoning. And when I proposed at the end that's what I think the archive that's hypersensitive to that existence, right? Because that then explains because much of what happens in Afrofuturism is to imagine worlds where slavery did not exist, or worlds that where the discourse of slavery does not affect the existence of those subjects. I'm trying to resist that and thinking that what I call hyper awareness of that archival presence is important for being able to resolve the passage through the threshold and over to the other side without what I said touching or being touched by the events or the points of resistance.
Thank you. So we're coming up to the last few minutes here. So if there's any last questions, we can gather that in the Q&A section. And if not, I would like to invite Professor Bogues if you would have any final remarks or questions before we give
I just want to say
word.
No, I just want to say thank you all very much for putting this on. To thank Professor Sawyer for a really insightful and presentation, and I think which represents a old line of thinking of his, but actually with new twists and turns, which I think is really very important. The only question I had was to thinking with Sentient Flesh, with Judy and Hortense, but thinking about the images you showed of Breonna Taylor, whether or not, quite frankly, thinking about the questions of memorialization, we don't have to think about skin. And I'm saying that because of the ways in which the images appear, both in Vanity Fair and elsewhere, and what is done to that skin, Black female skin, which I think one may want to think about the relationship of a kind of memorialization that evacuates what really happened to her, and that therefore, and how therefore in the portrait, skin becomes very important. What color she's painted,
right?
Or what color she is made to look like. That becomes really, I think, important. And therefore, the relationship between all those things, skin, flesh, and the body, particularly for the Black body. But thank you very, 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 very much.
No, thank you all for the opportunities. Really has been rich, and I appreciate all the questions. And this it's a work in progress. So your forbearance is appreciated. So
and thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks to the Advanced Knowledge Group.
Yeah, thank you all for joining today. I guess we can sign off and hopefully see you all at our next event.
Thank
you.